What if I told you that Carl Jung discovered a pattern among history's greatest minds, a pattern so rare that only 1% of people possess it? And what if you're one of them, but you've been hiding it your entire life? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why your mind works differently, and why that's not just okay, it's extraordinary. Carl Jung spent over 5 decades studying the human psyche, and he made a startling discovery. There exists a small percentage of individuals whose minds operate on a completely different frequency than the rest of humanity. These aren't necessarily the famous or the wealthy, they're the deep thinkers, the pattern seekers, the souls who see beyond the veil of ordinary consciousness. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are," but he also discovered that for most people, this privilege remains forever out of reach. Why? Because their minds simply aren't wired for the kind of psychological work that true individuation requires. But if you've ever felt like an alien among your own species, if you've ever wondered why your thoughts seem to operate on a different wavelength than everyone around you, you might be part of that extraordinary 1%. Sign 1. You question everything others accept as truth. Here's something most people will never admit: they live their entire lives never questioning a single belief they inherited. But you're different. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." While others accept societal norms without question, your mind naturally rebels against conformity. You don't just wonder what, you obsess over why. According to Carl Jung, this relentless questioning isn't a flaw, it's the hallmark of an individuated mind. Jung discovered that those who achieve true psychological maturity are the ones who dare to examine the foundations of their beliefs, even when it makes others uncomfortable. Think about the last time you were in a group conversation where everyone nodded along to a commonly accepted truth. While others were agreeing, your mind was probably dissecting the assumption, looking for holes, wondering about the origins of that belief. This isn't contrarianism, it's intellectual honesty. Jung observed that most people's beliefs are what he called collective assumptions, ideas they've absorbed from their culture, family, or peer group without ever subjecting them to conscious examination. He wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." Your questioning mind doesn't just challenge external truths, it turns inward with the same intensity. While 99% of people avoid self-examination like the plague, you've probably spent countless hours analyzing your own thoughts, motivations, and contradictions. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious, and he believed it was the most crucial step in human development. Most people, he observed, would rather remain unconscious than face the uncomfortable truths about themselves. But here's what makes your questioning even more profound. You don't question things to be difficult or rebellious. You question them because your mind instinctively understands that unexamined beliefs are psychological prisons. Carl Jung discovered that the questioning mind is actually seeking freedom, freedom from inherited limitations, cultural programming, and unconscious assumptions. This is why conversations with you can feel threatening to others. When you ask, "But why do we believe that?" or "What if we're wrong about this?" you're not just questioning an idea. You're questioning the entire foundation of how most people construct their reality. Jung said, "Thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge." Your mind naturally gravitates toward the difficulty of thinking rather than the ease of judging. And this leads us to something even more profound that Jung discovered about exceptional minds. Sign 2, you're comfortable with paradox and contradiction. While most people's minds shut down when faced with contradictions, yours comes alive. And Carl Jung knew exactly why. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But here's what he discovered: becoming who you truly are requires embracing the contradictions within yourself. Most people desperately need everything to fit into neat categories, good or bad, right or wrong, black or white. Their minds literally cannot tolerate ambiguity. But your mind naturally grasps what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing truths simultaneously. According to Carl Jung, this capacity for paradoxical thinking is what separates the truly evolved mind from the masses. He observed that great artists, philosophers, and innovators all shared this ability to dance with contradiction rather than flee from it. Jung discovered this through his own psychological journey. He wrote, "I am astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I am distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once and cannot add up the sum." This wasn't confusion, this was integration. You might have noticed this in yourself when you can genuinely see both sides of an argument, even when everyone around you has chosen a side. You understand that someone can be both kind and cruel, that success can feel like failure, that love and hate often intertwine. While others demand that you pick a side, your mind instinctively understands that reality is far more complex than binary choices. You've probably been accused of being wishy-washy or indecisive, when actually you're demonstrating a level of cognitive sophistication that most people can't comprehend. Jung discovered that this isn't confusion, it's wisdom. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Your mind naturally understands that transformation comes from embracing, not resolving, life's inherent contradictions. Carl Jung spent years studying what he called the union of opposites. He discovered that psychological growth happens not when we choose one side over another, but when we learn to hold both sides in creative tension. This is what he meant by the transcendent function, the mind's ability to create something new from the marriage of opposites. Here's what most people don't understand. When you express comfort with paradox, you're not being intellectually lazy. You're demonstrating what Jung called tertium quid, the third thing that emerges when opposites are held together rather than forced apart. Your mind doesn't need the false comfort of certainty. It thrives in the fertile uncertainty where new possibilities are born. But there's something even more telling about how your mind works, and it explains why you often feel like an outsider. Sign 3. You prefer depth over breadth in relationships. Here's a truth that might sting. While others collect friends like trophies, you'd rather have deep conversations with your own shadow than make small talk at parties. Carl Jung said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." This isn't social anxiety, it's intellectual hunger that most people simply cannot feed. According to Carl Jung, the individuated mind naturally gravitates toward depth because surface-level interactions feel like spiritual starvation. He discovered that exceptional minds don't just want to know what people think, they want to understand why they think it, how they came to believe it, and what lies beneath their conscious awareness. Think about the last party or social gathering you attended. While others were energized by moving from person to person, making light conversation, your energy was probably draining with each superficial exchange. It's not that you dislike people, it's that your mind craves authentic connection in a world obsessed with networking. Jung observed something fascinating about this pattern. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are," but he also discovered that becoming authentic requires finding others who can meet you at your level of depth. While 99% of people bond over shared activities or mutual interests, your mind seeks what he called authentic encounter, moments where masks drop and souls connect. You've probably experienced this. A single conversation with someone who truly understands can feel more nourishing than months of casual socializing. But here's what makes this even more profound. Your preference for depth isn't just about conversation, it extends to every relationship in your life. You probably have fewer friends than most people, but the friendships you do have operate at a level of intimacy and understanding that others find intimidating. Jung discovered that this preference isn't antisocial, it's highly social, but in a way that most people find threatening. Deep connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires courage that most people simply don't possess. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Your mind naturally seeks out others who have done this work, who can meet you in the depths rather than keeping you floating on the surface. This is why you probably feel more connected to certain authors, artists, or thinkers you've never met than to people you see every day. Your mind recognizes depth wherever it finds it, regardless of physical proximity. And here's something Jung discovered that might surprise you. The people who are drawn to depth the way you are often carry what he called the wounded healer archetype. You seek profound connection because you understand suffering, loss, and the complexity of the human condition in ways that others don't. And this brings us to perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of exceptional minds. Sign 4, you're drawn to the dark and uncomfortable. While others scroll past negative news or avoid difficult topics, your mind gravitates toward what Jung called the shadow, and there's a profound reason why. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." He discovered that exceptional minds aren't drawn to darkness out of morbidity, they're drawn to it out of completeness. According to Carl Jung, 99% of people spend their lives running from their shadow, the parts of themselves they don't want to acknowledge. But your mind instinctively understands that wholeness requires integration, not avoidance. Jung spent decades studying what he called shadow work, the psychological process of acknowledging and integrating the parts of ourselves we'd rather deny. He discovered that people with exceptional minds naturally gravitate toward this work, even when it's painful. Jung noticed this pattern in all his most brilliant patients. They were fascinated by tragedy, drawn to complex characters, intrigued by moral ambiguity. They didn't celebrate darkness, they studied it, learned from it, and ultimately transformed it. You've probably noticed this in yourself. While others are drawn to simple stories with clear heroes and villains, you're fascinated by the gray areas. You're more interested in understanding why the villain became villainous than in celebrating their defeat. Jung discovered that this attraction to shadow material isn't pathological, it's evolutionary. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Your mind naturally seeks out what others avoid because it understands that growth happens at the edges of comfort. Here's what Jung found most remarkable about this pattern. People with exceptional minds don't just explore external darkness, they're willing to confront their own shadow with the same unflinching attention. While others maintain carefully constructed self-images, you're probably acutely aware of your own capacity for selfishness, cruelty, or weakness. This isn't self-hatred, it's self-knowledge. Carl Jung discovered that the people who achieve the highest levels of psychological development are those who can acknowledge their full humanity, including the parts they're not proud of. Jung said, "I'd rather be whole than good." Your mind intuitively understands that goodness without wholeness is just a mask, and masks eventually slip. But here's where it gets really profound. Your willingness to explore darkness, both internal and external, actually makes you safer to be around, not more dangerous. Jung discovered that people who acknowledge their shadow are far less likely to unconsciously act it out than those who pretend it doesn't exist. You might recognize this in yourself when you're the person others come to with their deepest, darkest secrets. They sense that you won't judge them because you've already faced the same darkness in yourself. But here's where it gets really interesting, and why Jung believed this makes you dangerous to the status quo. Sign 5. You see patterns others miss. Your mind doesn't just process information, it weaves it into tapestries of meaning that others can't even perceive. And Carl Jung knew this was the mark of true genius. Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." He discovered that exceptional minds naturally develop what he called symbolic thinking, the ability to see connections that exist beyond the obvious. According to Carl Jung, while most people think linearly, A leads to B leads to C, your mind thinks systemically. You see how seemingly unrelated events connect, how patterns repeat across different contexts, how individual behaviors reflect collective unconscious trends. This isn't just intellectual pattern recognition, it's something much deeper. Jung called it synchronicity, the meaningful connections between inner and outer reality that most people dismiss as coincidence. Jung observed this in his most brilliant colleagues. They could predict social movements before they happened, understand personality types after brief encounters, and see the psychological currents underlying cultural phenomena. This wasn't psychic ability, it was pattern recognition at its highest level. You've probably experienced this yourself. Maybe you've watched a news story and immediately understood the deeper cultural forces at play. Or you've met someone new and instantly grasped patterns in their behavior that they themselves weren't conscious of. Jung discovered that this pattern-seeing ability comes from what he called active imagination, your mind's capacity to perceive the archetypal structures underlying surface reality. While others see isolated events, you see the underlying story. Here's what makes this even more extraordinary. Your pattern recognition doesn't just work in the present, it extends backward and forward through time. You can see how childhood experiences shaped current behaviors, how current trends will play out in the future, how historical patterns repeat themselves in new forms. Carl Jung spent years mapping what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that influence all human behavior. He discovered that people with exceptional minds can actually perceive these archetypal patterns in real time. This is why you might find yourself saying things like, "I've seen this movie before," when observing social situations, political movements, or relationship dynamics. Your mind recognizes the archetypal patterns playing out beneath the surface drama. But here's what Jung found most fascinating about this ability. The pattern-seeing mind doesn't just observe, it participates in the creation of meaning. When you see a pattern, you're not just recognizing something that already exists, you're helping to bring it into conscious awareness. Jung said, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." Your ability to see and name patterns actually helps shape collective consciousness. This pattern recognition reveals something profound about how your mind processes time itself. Sign 6, you think in timescales others can't comprehend. While most people live in the eternal now of immediate gratification, your mind naturally operates across what Jung called psychological time, and it changes everything about how you see the world. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he discovered that becoming requires a relationship with time that most people find impossible to sustain. According to Carl Jung, exceptional minds naturally think in generations, not moments. You see how today's choices echo across decades. You understand that personal growth unfolds over years, not weeks. You grasp that cultural shifts happen slowly, then suddenly. Jung himself embodied this long-term thinking. He spent decades developing his theories, understanding that true psychological insights couldn't be rushed. He often told his patients that the work of individuation, becoming who you truly are, was the task of a lifetime, not a weekend workshop. Jung noticed this temporal thinking in all his most developed patients. They could delay gratification not just for hours or days, but for years. They understood that meaningful work requires sustained effort across time periods that would discourage most people. They saw their lives as chapters in a larger story, not isolated experiences. You've probably noticed this in yourself. While others make decisions based on immediate payoffs, your mind automatically calculates long-term consequences. You might pass up short-term opportunities because you can see how they don't align with your larger trajectory. Jung discovered that this extended time perspective creates what he called future orientation consciousness. While others react to immediate circumstances, your mind naturally considers long-term consequences and generational impacts. Here's what makes this temporal thinking so profound. Your mind doesn't just think about the future, it thinks with the future. You make decisions not just based on who you are now, but on who you're becoming. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the transcendent function, the ability to bridge present and future selves. Carl Jung observed that people with this temporal consciousness often feel out of step with their contemporaries. You might feel like you're living slightly in the future, seeing possibilities and consequences that others won't recognize for years. This extended time awareness also affects how you process the past. While others try to get over difficult experiences, your mind understands that integration takes time, that some wounds need years to fully heal, that some insights only emerge through prolonged reflection. But here's what Jung discovered was most remarkable about this temporal thinking. It creates what he called psychological resilience. When you understand that current difficulties are temporary phases in a longer journey, you can endure challenges that would break others. You don't need immediate relief because you trust the process of time. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But he also discovered that this acceptance unfolds across years, not moments. Your mind instinctively understands this timeline in a way that others find incomprehensible. But there's something even more profound about how your mind works, something Jung believed was the ultimate sign of psychological evolution. Sign 7, you're your own harshest critic. Here's a painful truth: while others live in comfortable self-deception, your mind subjects itself to a level of scrutiny that would destroy most people's self-esteem. And Carl Jung understood why this is actually your greatest strength. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." He discovered that exceptional minds possess what he called ruthless self-honesty, the capacity to see themselves without the comforting filters most people require. According to Carl Jung, 99% of people protect their ego through elaborate defense mechanisms. They blame others, rationalize failures, and maintain illusions about their own perfection. But your mind instinctively dismantles these protections, even when it hurts. Jung spent years studying what he called the ego-self axis, the relationship between our conscious identity and our deeper, truer nature. He discovered that people with exceptional minds naturally develop a more honest relationship with this axis, even when it means facing uncomfortable truths. Jung observed this pattern in all his most evolved adolescents. They could acknowledge their flaws with brutal clarity, examine their motivations without flinching, and take responsibility for outcomes others would blame on circumstances. This wasn't self-hatred, it was self-mastery. You've probably experienced this internal critic in action. After social interactions, you might replay every word you said, analyzing what you could have done better. After making mistakes, you probably dissect them with scientific precision, looking for lessons and patterns. While others dismiss their errors or blame external circumstances, your mind automatically turns inward. What was my role in this? What pattern am I repeating? How can I grow from this experience? Jung discovered that this internal criticism serves a crucial evolutionary function. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Your harsh self-criticism is actually your psyche's way of driving growth and preventing stagnation. But here's what Jung found most remarkable about this self-criticism. It creates what he called authentic humility. Unlike false modesty, which is actually a form of pride, your self-criticism comes from genuine recognition of your human limitations and potential for growth. This relentless self-examination creates a paradox: the more harshly you judge yourself, the more compassionate you become toward others. You understand human frailty because you've faced your own. Jung observed that people who achieve the highest levels of psychological development are those who can maintain what he called conscious suffering. The ability to face their own imperfections without either denying them or being destroyed by them. Here's something Jung discovered that might surprise you. Your harsh self-criticism actually makes you more trustworthy, not less. Others sense that you hold yourself to high standards, which means you're likely to hold yourself accountable in relationships and commitments. Carl Jung said, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." Your internal critic is actually helping you maintain individual integrity in a world that often rewards conformity and self-deception. And this leads us to the final sign, the one Jung believed was the ultimate indicator of an exceptional mind. Sign 8, you feel responsible for things beyond your control. While others shrug off global problems as, "not my responsibility," your mind carries the weight of the world, literally. And Carl Jung discovered this wasn't neurosis, but awakening. Carl Jung said, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." He observed that exceptional minds naturally develop what he called collective responsibility, a felt sense of connection to the larger human story. According to Carl Jung, most people live in what he termed personal unconsciousness, concerned only with their immediate circle of influence. But your mind has broken through to what he called collective consciousness, where individual and universal concerns merge. Jung spent years studying this phenomenon through his concept of the collective unconscious, the shared psychological heritage of humanity. He discovered that people with exceptional minds can actually feel the weight of collective human experiences, even when they haven't directly experienced them themselves. Jung noticed this in all his most developed patients. They felt personally affected by distant tragedies. They worried about future generations they'd never meet. They carried guilt for social problems they didn't create. This wasn't grandiosity.